This is a recording of J. Judson, Judd Cordis, of 4722 Grand Woods Drive, Lansing, Michigan, 48917. Judd's phone number is area code 517-323-2414. The recording was made at the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River on May 12th, 1989 by Jim Walkinshaw of the History Center. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Hey Judd, maybe you'd start, if you would, with your name and address and phone number.
Well, my name is Judd Cordis. I live at 4722 Grand Woods Drive, Lansing, 48917. Phone number is 323-2414.
Great. Now, if you would just take us back to when you started at Oldsmobile, or GMI in this case.
Well, I started in August of 1942 as a GMI student. And by the following November, I enlisted in the Navy and came back in January of 1946 and continued at GMI and graduated in 1950.
What did you do that first year then, prior to going in the service, Judd? What were your...
Well, the first few months?
Yeah. Do you remember anything about the...
Yeah, I worked in the 75 millimeter tube. They were making cannons at that time for the Army.
Yeah.
It was a 75 millimeter cannon.
You were working right on production?
Yeah, well, this was we call it inspection.
Oh, okay.
It stuck a plug on a barrel. If it went all the way through, it was straight. And if it didn't, it had a bend in it.
Yeah. Where was that? Do you remember where you were doing that?
I don't remember the name of the building. I remember the name of the foreman. His name was Wineshank.
Oh, yeah.
Bill Wineshank. But as far as the building numbers, I don't identify with those. But
was that a month on, month off thing?
well, the school started. I started in August, and school started in mid-September. So I worked there probably 6 weeks, and then went to school for 4 weeks,
And then
came back, and well, the war was going on, and I decided I'd leave my studies and go in the Navy.
Okay.
And,
Then you came back again?
Came back January 1946.
Okay.
And started in GMI again.
All right. And then at that time, were we making cars now, or we were still making guns?
Yeah, we were making cars. I think they started car production just about the time they started car production. I think they started car production in the fall of '45.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So they were making cars for maybe 2 or 3 months when I got back.
All right.
And they, well, I know when the plant was on strike at that time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was that long
110
100+
or 20 days thing.
Yeah, and they had those tech students over here at Central High School.
Oh.
Yeah.
What were you guys doing over there then?
Well, we couldn't get in the plant.
Yeah.
So they put us down, mustered us in down there to Central High.
Oh, yeah. Did they put you assignments and so
Oh, yeah, you had school assignments.
Okay.
Yeah, the guys that were in school, I hadn't started back yet. The guys that were in school worked on their assignments, and those of us that didn't have a school assignment got some other type of assignment from the local coordinator.
Were there other folks there in the building with you?
That was Central High was still being used as a high school then, because they hadn't started community college yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pendergast was the principal.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I know we were returning veterans, or most of us were.
Yeah.
And, we were, of course, 5 or 6 years older than the average run of the kid down there. And there was a few interesting times with the local principal down there, but other than that, there was
Some pretty good-sized kids there.
yeah, bigger than the average.
Yeah.
God, I remember that old Kewpie hamburger was down there, and
You're right downtown. Yeah.
about a block and a half from high school, and they had the best hamburgers in the world.
Yeah.
They were just great. Well, then the strike was settled, and we started back at GMI, it must have been about March of that year, March of '46.
Okay. You were still doing the month on, month off thing?
Yeah, 4 weeks there and 4 weeks here. And then I went in the engine plant as a student about, 48.
Okay.
I worked on various assignments there. That became my home assignment. I came back there from school. I'd go back to the engine plant
All right.
every other month.
Now were you out on the production side of the house
Yeah,
again?
yeah.
Okay. Making parts?
Yeah.
That sort of thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Was the rocket there yet at that point?
Yeah, we're just starting up. Marv Katke was superintendent.
Uh-huh.
Bill Rasmussen was the plant engineer in charge of putting the equipment in.
Okay.
Then Marv Katke went with Ford. And several of the supervisors that were in that plant went with him.
Oh, yeah.
Then Lou Church came over from the old straight 6 and 8 plant. He was
Okay.
superintendent.
Now, the V8 stuff was all in that, like that building 36, 38 area?
Yeah, then that expanded out into, we've been the south end of that 36, because at one time that was full of small presses.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, and
Okay.
then they extended that area south and moved a small press plant over at 34.
All right.
But basically, all of that V8 engine was contained right in that 36, 38 for the first year or two.
Uh-huh.
Then,
Do you remember how fast the line would go?
I think at that time it was going 45 an hour.
45.
Yeah.
Was that kind of a one-shift thing, or did they run two
No,
shifts?
that was 2 shifts.
2 shifts. Huh?
Well, that was 2 shifts, and then later on, they went to 3. Because by 1955, that was the year we made over 500,000
Right.
engines, and that was the biggest, most productive year in history.
Yeah.
And we were on 3 shifts.
Okay.
Prior to that, I think the biggest year was about 250,000 cars.
Wasn't very many.
No.
Yeah. Did you get down in the old 6 and the old straight 8 plant at all?
Yeah, a little bit. When I was, I believe that was one of my first work assignments down there. First foreman was George Walker. His son Bob Walker was shop chairman over the plant too.
Yeah.
And he's got a son here now, Scott Walker.
3 generations.
So there's 3 generations of him.
Uh-huh.
But I remember George Walker at that time. Must have been in his late 50s, early 60s. He had a 40-year. He was given while I was working that month. His 40-year ring.
Isn't that something?
I thought that, my God, 40 years.
The oldest guy in history.
The
right?
oldest guy in history. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That was in the crankshafts.
Where was it? You remember where the cranks were?
Yeah, it was right there in Building 28.
It was.
Yeah, it was building. All those numbers.
Yeah, they all run together.
Run together, but
Yeah.
it was 28. It was along the wall. Then that was moved over to Plant 3.
Okay.
Oh, about 10 years later, I guess. But
Yeah.
all the cranks were transported. I remember those little A-frames with dollies.
Pushed.
Yeah, they held about 6 or 8 cranks, and you pushed them from machine to machine.
Isn't that something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Was the old straight 6 assembly line still over there?
Yeah, they were still making 6 cylinders. I think that must have gone out about 48.
Yeah, I think maybe 50 was the last year they used
Yeah.
that.
Because Arnold Hanson was in there, Jim Hughes. Both of them are later general superintendents that
Uh-huh.
we worked for.
Yeah. Do you remember anything, Judd, about how people managed the business in those days? How foremen managed their people? Was it?
Yeah, each department had a foreman, and then they had let's call him a group leader.
Okay.
An hourly group leader.
Yeah.
And this hourly group leader had most of the responsibility as far as, showing you how to run the machine and making sure that the place ran.
Okay. Sort of like an assistant foreman.
Yeah, kind of like a straw, I guess they used to call them straw bosses.
Uh-huh.
So you had more contact with the group leader than you did the supervisor, I mean,
Okay.
as far as on a
Yeah.
routine basis.
Yeah. How about size of groups? Were they 20, 30,
Yeah,
50?
about 20. I would say 25 to 30.
Uh-huh.
I remember Al Cole. Remember him?
No? No.
Yeah, he was a group leader down there in the water pump.
Okay.
Claude Russell was the foreman, and Al Cole was the group leader.
Oh, co-op. Yeah, I do too now.
Yeah, he was one of the first early retirees. He retired at 55. No one ever did figure out how he did it because he did it long before it became popular.
Before anybody heard of
He
it.
died here just a short time ago. His brother was Clayton Kowalk, the local coach.
Okay, yeah.
I remember Al, he came up to me one day. Al was always chewing snuff.
Oh, jeez.
And he says, "Here, Judd, want some?" I says, "No, I don't." He says, "A good thing you don't." He says, "'Cause I'd have kicked you right in the rear if you'd taken it."
Really? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, he was quite a guy, yeah.
Was the plant, Judd, help us a little on what I'll call plant operating conditions, safety, cleanliness, those kinds of things as contrasted maybe to later on?
Well, safety glasses became mandatory there in the late 40s. That was probably one of the biggest, first real positive strides in what you might call industrial safety. And Oldsmobile led the industrial world in that.
All right.
Because we'd go to visit other plants and there wasn't any such thing as safety glasses.
Isn't that interesting?
But the Oldsmobile Safety Department was highly regarded and thought of as for their ability to establish those safety procedures. And as far as the plant was well maintained.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably for ventilation, the rocket engine plant, as we refer to it, probably was the best ventilated. Of course, it was far superior to the 06 and 8.
Yeah.
But they all had ventilation. In fact, there was a few folks that lost their paychecks up the ductwork because it was something new, and they were doing a good job on the ventilating, and the guy would get paid, and he'd lay his paycheck down when he got his wallet out of his pocket or something. The first thing you know, it has been sucked up. That didn't happen very often, but I remember a couple of times.
But the first time a guy did that, he wouldn't do it again.
No. But the lighting, of course, you look back now compared to what we've done, I suppose it wouldn't have looked as good to you, but in having nothing else to compare it to. But
Yeah. So people didn't feel uncomfortable with what at that.
Well,
junction.
you know, it's true. We'd go and visit other plants and other industry, and I would always come back thankful that I worked at Oldsmobile because we did have good facilities and they were well maintained, and the painting scheme on the old rocket engine, you know, that green and white.
Yeah.
That was before that it was kind of a battleship gray.
All right.
So there was I don't know what you'd call it, ergonomics, but it was relating to the workplace.
Was it a struggle on the safety glass thing to get folks
Oh,
to
there
use those?
were incidents where people were always trying to beat the system, but I guess you'd find that anywhere where they just wear the frames and pull the glass out.
incidents.
Yeah, it was. But basically, overall, it was well received.
That's interesting. Well, after you got out of GMI, Judd, what happened? What'd you get to do?
Well, I was a college graduate training for 6 or 8 months, and I became a foreman there in the engine plant.
What area?
I was connecting rods,
Okay.
block floor,
This is on the V8?
V8, yeah. Oil pumps, water pumps, push rods. Oh, there was round and sharp cutoff machines.
Wow, you had a lot of different stuff.
Yeah. Then about a year and a half later, I became a general foreman.
Judd, stick with the foreman thing for a minute. Can you remember back to what I call a typical day that you might have gone through? What might have happened on a typical day? What you would do as a foreman?
Well, the first thing you did make sure you took a roll,
Okay.
so you knew who was there and who wasn't there. And you did that prior to the start of the shift.
How did you do that?
Oh, to go to the time clock
Okay.
and see who had punched in.
All right.
And then those that were absent, if you had any absent. Absenteeism wasn't the problem then, it is now.
Oh. Okay.
Your absenteeism, I don't think, if I remember right, would run over maybe 1 or 2%. In fact, after a long layoff due to one of the strikes, that absenteeism was just about non-existent. It was about half of 1%.
Isn't that interesting?
But now your absenteeism, well, I don't know exactly what it is, but probably 8 or 10%. But absenteeism wasn't the problem then. But you'd make sure that the jobs you were going to run that day had people on them, and those that were absent, you had to make the adjustment and move people around. And the main thing is you'd have a number of people trained to do different jobs.
All
so
right.
you did have that flexibility.
Was that kind of a goal then, to have people that were very flexible in what they could do?
But later on, why that became very popular when it was editorialized by the educators and so on and so forth, that you broke up the routine and the monotony, but it was a smart thing to do anyway.
Yeah.
And
so really not a new idea at all.
no,
Yeah.
well, it just had a different nomenclature to it.
Yeah.
Most of this stuff isn't new, you know. The educators and people have developed a vocabulary that's more sophisticated, but the basic elements have been there. Because after all, they didn't go out and invent it. They had to find it someplace. All they did was give it a name.
Right. Did you have a schedule that you worked to? How did you know what to make?
Well, you were based on, well, the first thing you had to do is figure your manpower.
Okay.
You figured that from your schedule and from your time routings. The Wayne Chafee organization and the Fred Lenz organization.
Okay, time study.
Time studies, and you'd figure your manpower from that. And then your schedule was based on the engines that you were to produce per day. And then if you had to have 8 per engine, you did your arithmetic. If you had to have 1 per engine, whatever it happened to be.
But they didn't hand you a big piece of paper that make 20 rods and 40.
That didn't become popular until it became more sophisticated with our electronic gadgetry.
Okay.
But that's another story that came along, in the mid-'60s, when IBM invented this green and white paper that they wanted to plaster the world with.
Right.
I was in the press plant at that time, and oh God, it was popular. Before that, if you were, suppose you had to have 10,000 stampings, and you used 10 a day, why, it meant you're going to have enough for 10 days, so I ought to set the die a day or so early, so the foreman would go through his calendar and mark the day so he could set brand X.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, the die would be sharpened or whatever needed to be done. But then we became sophisticated with computers and decided we're going to help the guy. So he'd go out there in the morning and give him a stack of this green and white paper about 8 inches thick. Because at that time, the press plant had over 1,000 parts that they were making. So here was a guy that was going to produce, he was responsible for maybe 10% of those parts, and you gave him the stack of IBM paper and said, here, this is going to help you. You wade through this and figure out when you got to set brand X again or brand A. When his little calendar was more than adequate, had been doing a very good job, but that got ironed out later on, and there was an exception reporting instead of just giving him the whole telephone book to find the number in, where you give it to him by exception. That was probably, there was more struggle with that than there was with the safety class program.
It was.
But basically, getting back to the original question of a routine day, you had your safety, and that was dependent on the department, whether you had to have sleeves, canvas sleeves, which was the press plant.
Gloves.
And of course you didn't wear gloves on a drill press. And you wore safety glasses, and safety shoes were encouraged. Of course you couldn't wear tennis shoes, open-toed sandals and things like that. But the main thing was the human side of the business, to get to know all your folks, what their personalities were, was probably one of the prime ingredients of being a good supervisor. Of course, that became more popular as time marched on. But if you knew your people and knew your equipment and knew the product, that was primarily the 3 things I used to concentrate on.
Did you try to, what I'll call, understand how people were best at certain things, and so that you would place those?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Some people, of course, some of us are more mechanically inclined or less mechanically inclined.
Yeah.
And you had those. We even had some, well, I hesitate to call them handicapped, but they were blind folks.
Sure.
And they had a few jobs that you could use them on. In fact, that was another, big plus for Oldsmobile. There was quite a few of the handicapped folks, blind people that were employed. I remember the engine plant back then had about 3 or 4 of them. Very, very fine people. And in the press plant, there was a number of them.
And those fellows and gals, they worked just as well for those particular applications as folks that weren't?
Sometimes even better. There was a fellow in the press plant by the name of George Mackett. George, there was jobs that George could do, like welding nuts and bolts on various parts of sheet metal. He could do that and do a better job, neater job than a lot of the sighted folks could do.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And they were very dependable.
How about women in the workplace, Judd? Anything in that?
Oh, that's
50s?
changed a lot back. Years ago, they couldn't drive a fork truck, and they couldn't use a wrench or lift or over breast high, and there was a lot of things that, because of their physique, that the medical world didn't think the women could do. So you were restricted and limited into how many women you could use based on the reasons I just mentioned. But then as time marched on, we found that, our industry found that women could drive forklift trucks and they could reach a wrench, breast high, and a few other things like that. So the equal opportunity got in.
Did you have any in that first area that you were following? You had some folks?
Well, during the war, of course, there was a lot of women that were working in the plant on various jobs.
All right.
And they were just transferred right on into automobile production.
Okay.
No, I can't speak for what it was like prior to the war.
No, that's all right.
I think it was rather limited and even non-existent. But small parts department, the north end of 36, there in the engine plant.
Oh, yeah.
We had quite a few women folks in there on oil pumps, water pumps, valve guides, oil pump shafts, and then the assembly line.
Would the block floor have been mostly guys?
Yeah, they were all men. Yeah, because of the thing I just mentioned, the
weight
mass,
thing.
the size. Because you were, even though it was probably the first quasi-automated line with transfer equipment, you still had to pile blocks between operation and change cutters, and some of those cutters were size of a small automobile wheel.
Yeah.
And that's more than women and some men. It was more.
Oh, sure. Heavy things. Yeah. How about quality, Judd? How did you address that during the early days?
Well, we were probably within just an eyelash of having the statistical process of quality control that you hear of now, because the engine plant at that time was accepting or rejecting by lot. In other words, statistically, I could go over to that lot and I would inspect X number, and based on what the result was, whether I could accept the rest of it. And that was back in the early 50s.
Isn't it?
And, well, Bob Smith had purchase work back on that, and reliability or inspection it was then called. So that was happening in the engine plant, and we came within just a ace of having what Dr. Deming took to Japan, and Japan comes back 30 years later, and here we thinking, saying, oh, how great it is. And so quality was up front. It's just sad that, too bad that looking back now that we didn't pursue it.
Was
from
it
that standpoint.
You as a foreman, what were your tools, not your tools, but what were you measured on?
Well, you were measured primarily on efficiency.
Okay.
But people say, oh yeah, I knew it. All you got to do is get the iron out. Well, that's true, but inside of efficiency, you got to define it.
Good.
Yeah, you had to have good parts. You had to have low scrap. You had to have, utilize the people. By that, I don't mean abuse them, I mean utilize them so you didn't have them standing around. But so there's a lot of things that fall inside of efficiency that other than just get the iron out the door.
Yeah.
And I never, in my experience, we never, in any areas I worked in, ever operated on the philosophy, why, by God, ship them.
At all costs.
No, but
so to speak.
what you read about, I don't buy a car made on Monday or buy one on Friday and that stuff. And I don't agree with that at all. Maybe I was living in a different world than a lot of others, but I took exception to the fact that quality was not right up their front, because inside of your efficiency were the things I'm talking about. And safety was primarily the primary importance. You're not going out there and expect people to run a job where they're going to be injured on, because it isn't good for them, it isn't good for the product, it isn't good for the business, because if you're in business today, you'd like to be in business tomorrow, and I think that's one reason Oldsmobile has been around for 100 years, is the fact that, someplace on your wall here, you probably have got that note that they wrote 90-some years ago, make it in as good manner as possible. Basically, that's the idea. The tools we use to do that today are a little more sophisticated than they were then, but the thought and the idea is still there. So all at once, people gone out and discovered quality. Gosh, we've been sitting right here on top of it, but I think it's kind of jerks you around when people want to tell you the Japanese are.
Did the new block line work okay? It must have been a brand new concept and new thing.
Oh, it works about as well as any of that equipment does. It works very well when it works, and when it doesn't, why, it's... you had operators at every machine. The machine might be 50 feet long with about 8 or 9 different stations in it. But the transferring between machines didn't come along until, mid-60s.
Oh, so how did you get around?
Well, you had a roller conveyors.
So you just had to push.
Yeah. You had somebody there that was pulling them along the conveyor and loading them in and cycling them in. Once they got into the machine and started the cycle, why, then they automatically transfer arms.
Did we, because that was kind of new, Judd. We wasn't I mean, the old engine plant was what? Single purpose?
That was all single purpose push and shove.
So this type of machinery must have been a new experience for us at that juncture. How did, maintenance-wise, what did we do to keep things running? That must be different.
Well, even though it was a transfer machine, X number of feet long, it was just a series of single-purpose machines hooked together. And the commonality there, of course, was the transfer bar. And you had your maintenance crews on each shift. The biggest problem, I think, probably as far as maintaining them was schedules there in 1955.
Then we got high volume.
Because then you went to 3 shifts, and when they broke down, why, you moved the people someplace else where their equipment was repaired. But you didn't have your electronic interlocks and all that you have today. Your panel boards are the all mechanical switch.
Big old relays.
The relays. I should remember the name of those relays.
That was a couple of years ago.
But you'd get an electrician over and he'd open the panel box and he'd poke the relay, and if it took off, it didn't. If it didn't, well, he changed it because the springs were weak in it. Where now that panel box, it was 9 feet high and 15 feet long. It's probably a little card that's about as big as a notepad.
Well, now you were a foreman then for a year and a half, a year or so, and then you became general foreman. Still in the engine plant.
Engine plant. And I went to the press plant in 1958 as a general foreman,
Okay.
over at sheet metal finish.
You went right from the engine plant to there.
Yeah.
When you were in the engine plant as general foreman, were you still in the new rocket
Yeah,
engine siding?
Yeah.
Okay. How did the general foreman's job differ at that point in time from the foreman's job, John?
Well, the foreman would have a block floor or a head floor, or the department, and the general foreman would have a half a dozen of them.
Okay.
You'd have 4 or 5 foremen that were reporting to you.
What did you, as a general foreman, then have to do?
Well, you helped with the manpower allotment. You helped in
Okay.
scheduling, material. Probably material is one of the bigger items because Central Foundry supplied all our castings.
Okay.
Of course, they were stretched to the limit too on those higher schedules. And
Did you have to work more closely with your plant superintendent and that sort of thing?
yeah, you reported directly to the plant superintendent.
All right.
Then about 1959, why the 8th level assistant superintendent layer was added. Then
All right.
the general foreman reported to him.
Okay. Did the approach of the general foreman approaching to the superintendent, did that work okay?
General foreman to the superintendent? Yeah. Well, in fact, you know, that layer was added, and then 20 years later, the effort was to eliminate a layer.
Right.
So whether it was, by today's standards, it was an unnecessary layer, or something in there was an unnecessary layer.
Yeah.
It was either the general foreman or the assistant. Of course, that's getting back to the layer. Why? It's like getting back to the quality we talked about before, whether accepting and rejecting by statistical lot, which later on we find out the Japanese were doing so well with. Same way with this layer elimination. We had one less layer years ago that we added one, and we found out 20 years later, well, that wasn't such a good idea anymore. What goes around comes around, I guess.
Judd, who was the superintendent down the engine plant while you were down there? Was that Lou Church?
Lou Church, Ed Martin.
Can you describe those individuals? We don't, I mean, they're gone, we don't know much about them. What kind of folks were they?
Well, Lou Church was a graduate of the Rio Apprentice School, which at that time was one of the foremost apprentice schools in the country, so I've been told.
All right.
And Lou, I guess you'd classify him as a taskmaster. He was very explicit in what he needed and what he wanted, and that was good plant relationships, good housekeeping, good quality, all the things that we've all been very accustomed to. And I probably learned more from that individual working for him as to what, by our values, were the values that we needed in our job than anybody I ever worked for.
Did they have regular get-togethers
Oh
with
yeah,
folks?
he'd have a superintendent's meeting on a minimum of once a week with all the supervision.
All right.
Which later on became very popular. We found out because people weren't having enough meetings.
Right.
A lot of people viewed him as a tough guy to work for, but the only reason he was a tough guy to work for if you didn't do what was considered your job. In other words, he didn't expect to have to tell you more than one time, or even one time, because if it was something pretty obvious, you should have taken care of it yourself.
Did he spend a lot of time out on the floor?
Yeah. Yeah, he was from the old school. They always wore a hat. Remember these pictures you see of the people in the plant always wore the, I guess they call them fedora hats. Yeah. And a vest. And a vest, yeah.
But not a coat. He wouldn't have a suit coat on.
Oh yeah, he'd have a suit coat on occasionally, yeah. But
all right.
he came from the old hat and vest group.
Where was his office at that time?
It's the north end of 36.
Right up there where the old office used to be?
Right there. Yeah, the general foreman had an office up there. And the night superintendent, who at that time was Ed Martin,
All right.
he was up there.
How about Ed Martin? Tell us about him a little bit if you can.
He was a little different type of person than Louis was. Probably a little more, well, let's call it, by today's definition, a little more laid back.
All right.
Lou was a little more effervescent. But there were different personalities, but basically their sense of values were the same.
Mm-hmm.
I found them very good people to work for. Then there's other folks that, Art Miller was one of my first general foremen, and Fred Webb. I think Fred's still alive.
Yeah, I remember that name.
Art Miller's gone. Then when I went to the press plant, Bill Freeman was superintendent over there.
Okay. You went over there as a general foreman?
Yeah.
All right.
Sheet metal.
What area?
Sheet metal finish.
Okay.
That was over there in building 28, where you did a lot of welding.
27.
27. 20, wait, yeah, you're right. 28's the engine. 27B, in fact,
Yeah.
it was 27B.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah, you're right. Thank you. 27B. Yeah. That's where you prepped the sheet metal for paint.
Which was what
Then you shipped hoods.
kinds of things did you do there, Judd, or did the guys do? What were the?
Well, some of the things, like the Tornado fender, early the 66 Tornado, that had that sharp nose on it. You had to weld because it couldn't be drawn. It was too acute. You welded a heliarctic patch in that, and then finished off the weld, probably got it ready for paint. Then the hoods in those days, you didn't have the inner liner. You had about 4 or 5 individual pieces that you welded in.
Mm-hmm.
And then you shipped from there to what they were called BOP plants then.
Okay.
You made hood hinges, and then you hung a lot of sheet metal and miscellaneous stock on the bound rising prime line.
Where was that thing at that time?
Same building, 27.
It was. Okay.
That wound up through the paint plant, went through
Mhm.
dip tanks.
Mm-hmm.
That was a one-shift operation because that was in '58. It was one of those down years in the automobile world.
Oh,
We
yeah.
had that big one in '55, and then we came out with that '58 Olds that were just dripping with chrome. Remember that one?
Sure
Looked like
do.
a rolling jukebox.
Yeah.
And that didn't sell too well. And we were on one shift there. And Final was working one shift in those days also.
Uh-huh.
And then
You say Bill Freeman was the superintendent at that time?
Bill retired in about '67, and I became superintendent.
All right. Once again, there were no assistant superintendents at that point in time?
Well, yeah, wait a minute. Yes, there was. Because excuse me. I became an assistant superintendent over there prior to Bill's retirement.
Okay. So they had instituted that?
Yeah,
extra
that's
layer
right.
there.
They instituted that about '59, and then I became an assistant superintendent about '61 or '62.
Okay.
And then when Bill retired in '67, I became superintendent.
Did why do you think that layer was put in there, Judd, the assistant superintendent thing?
Well, part of it goes back. I remember I mentioned a guy by the name of Al Kowalk, who
Yes.
was a group leader.
Yeah.
Well, there was an edict, and as I remember it, it was explained to me, there was an edict by the National Labor Relations Board that one hourly person could not give job instructions or orders to another hourly person.
Oh.
So that eliminated that straw boss group leader. Well, what would happen then if a foreman was on vacation or sick? Well, you had to process 215D or D to put a person on salary temporarily to take his place, to overcome the fact that 1 hour you had to put a guy on salary.
Yeah.
Well, the paperwork took so long on something like that, the guy gave you back from vacation or back from sick leave by the time it got processed. So you were still, didn't have that hole plugged.
Yeah.
So the idea behind this assistant superintendent was to provide the assistance when there was sickness or absenteeism in the supervisory ranks.
Oh, yeah.
So that supposedly was one of the arguments for instituting that layer.
Did it work?
Not really, no. Not
Seemed
really.
like it was too high, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. What it was supposed to do was if there was a foreman that was off, with a general foreman to take his place. Then the assistant superintendent would take the general foreman's place. But that didn't work that well for one big reason is that people aren't that versatile that rapidly. Now, supposedly you know all the folks and you know the equipment, but if a guy calls in sick on Monday morning, all at once the general foreman's got to go out there, and he could do it because we did it. But it is not what you might call a real smooth, workable expectation to have those slots filled that smooth and that quickly. So it really didn't work that well. And the old 215D was still alive until people from outside the organization came in. They never did understand what that was, because where they came from, they handled it their way, and whether it was right or wrong with the material, that was one of the reasons for that layer.
How about Bill Freeman? Once again, here's a guy that we, other than the fact we may have known the name, but we don't know much about him either. Can you describe Bill?
Bill was a different type of personality, I guess. Of course, we all are different from each other.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. Bill understood people probably as well, if not better, than a lot of the folks at that time. Maybe that was due to his outside interests. I guess Bill was quite interested in nature. He was president of the I think it was the Michigan State Birdwatchers Society at one time. He was quite active in that. But Bill was pretty well fit the mold of most of the folks that we know. He was more quiet than some.
People kind of person?
Yeah, he was a people kind of person. Probably more so than others that we've been exposed to for whatever reason.
Was the supervision changing in type during that era?
Yeah.
Was there a change from what I call the 30s, 40s, maybe bad word, but Bull of the Woods is sort of...
Yeah, the old Bull, the baggy pants, Bull of the Woods that we remember in the old cartoon strip. That did pretty well. I really don't believe in my career I ever ran across.
You never saw much of that.
No, I didn't. Maybe when you ask somebody else, they said, yeah, Judd Cordes is one for all I know, but really, no, but it's all of the person's viewpoint.
It's how you perceive it, right?
So I didn't really see much of that. This blind obedience business, by God, you do it my way or I'll bust you. I never really saw any of that.
People could voice their opinions and people would accept and listen to them, not necessarily accept it, but at least listen to them.
Yeah, in my experience, that was pretty much the case. Of course, somebody's always going to find an exception to it.
Oh, sure. And we don't always agree.
Yeah. But I didn't, particularly in the press plant where you were pretty labor intensive.
Yeah.
Because, you talked about the automated equipment and transfer machines that came in the engine plant in the 40s. I don't believe that type of equipment got in the press plant for 20 years later.
Okay.
Because those Danley presses that were put in the press plant here in the early 80s, Danley transfer, that was really the first time that we had that type of equipment.
Everything else was manned?
Yeah, you passed it from, you had these side-by-side presses. You didn't have it. The only transfer presses you had were some of the, 1,000-ton transfer dies that you were making differential covers on. You probably had a 7 or 8 station die. But as far as hooking up a bunch of presses and running them through like you hooked up a bunch of milling machines and drilling machines.
Mhm.
The press industry, the sheet metal industry was 15, 20 years behind
Isn't that interesting?
the machine tool.
Uh-huh.
The chip
Yeah,
people.
yeah. Do you remember, Judd, what you were making where in the plant when you were assistant and superintendent down there? What was kind of being
Well, out there in 50 and 52, you made oil pans, brackets, underbody brackets, and then out in 56, you made hoods, and before injection molding came in, you made filler plates.
Okay.
Then injection molding came in the mid-early 60s. That was quite an innovative effort. 2,500-ton injection molding machines making filler plates. They were made out in 52.
Okay.
Then out in 34 was small presses.
37.
37.
Was that there when you?
Yeah, 37 was there. Well, if you went back in the 50s, they were making guns in there. I think it was
Okay.
for the Korean War.
Yeah, big tubes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But then put some, well, we call them automatic presses in out there. That was your 7 or 8 pass station transfer
Uh-huh.
dies. And the fender line was out there in 37.
Before it got out there, where was it? Do you remember where it was?
Fender line?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was there in 56. There was some presses there right along the aisle where the SMC is now.
Kind of as you went in the big door from the alleyway.
Yeah, right across from the dye room.
Oh, yeah, all right. And the dye room's kind of been always there in that
Yeah.
corner of 57.
Yeah, those presses were they were making fenders out there in 37. They went in there about 55 after
Okay.
that big boom year we had.
All right.
When they went in there in 55, they were just side-by-side presses that
Uh-huh.
you transferred. Each press had a man on them, and each press had a conveyor. And you conveyed it from press to press to press. You didn't have any automatic transfer type of equipment.
Hand loaded.
Yeah.
The guy put it in.
Hand loaded, hand unloaded it, stacked it stood it on end on a conveyor, took to the next operation.
Okay.
You had about 7 of those.
Uh-huh. How about
They
press?
were open-sided presses.
Okay. How about press safety, Judd? What was going on in that arena?
Well, all of your pins were guarded. That's your alignment pins or rider pins on the dies, and there was a strong hands out of die policy.
Okay.
In other words, your dies were engineered to provide openings, so if you had to lay a fender in there, why you were not putting your hand underneath the die steel.
Weren't pinched. You couldn't get pinched.
But that was a very, then on the smaller presses, you had tongs and you had suction cups where you could load the parts in the presses without exposing your hands to the dies. There was a lot of the die guard business for providing hanging guards for presses. That was a little department in its own down there, worked out of the die shop. But even with all those precautions and your safety instructions, we still had some serious injuries. Fingers, hands.
Would those be mostly caused because of what would lack
Well,
of attention?
just a lack of attention, yeah.
Was the press shop, how would you contrast that to the engine plant from the standpoint of just work in general? Was it?
Well, it's quite a bit, but of course your main ingredient is people. There wasn't any big change there, but the change in the type of operation, the presses, the noise factor was pretty intense in the press shop. The scheduling, like I mentioned previously, was more or less on an individual basis.
Okay.
Because you were putting dies in, you were changing them on schedule, you had a midnight shift that did nothing but change dies. So the whole atmosphere, the technology, of course, was different. I would think that the main thing that was transferable was dealing with people.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it was might not be transferable because of the engine plant where you were dealing in thousandths of an inch or less, and in the press plant you were dealing in fractions to put your quality in perspective.
How did you address the quality issue with sheet metal stuff?
Well, when you set a die, it was the responsibility of the die tryout people who, once that die got set, was to run a part and then take it to the inspection crib for approval. And they had their gauges, depending on what it was. Sometimes there were a little wooden model that they laid on.
Mm-hmm.
Other times they had to put it on a surface plate. Other times they had to put it on a jig, depending on if it was a fender, you'd have to put it on the jig and compare it with the other fender and how it fit to the hood. And once you got approval, well, that part stayed with that die until you made that run. And then there were gauges on the presses that periodically you'd have to put the part on those to make sure you had all the holes punched out and the form was right. And of course, sheet metal being what it is, why you'd have times run into crack problems or buckle problems, and adjustments that have to be made during the run to eliminate your buckle or eliminate your cracks. Incoming quality in sheet metal is always quite a significant fact.
The raw steel.
Yeah. And on the like on the surface visual parts for cosmetic purposes, the fenders and the hoods that was critical. And if the orange peel, that's a byproduct of drawing the material. And on the underbody parts, the problem would be on those whether they were cracked or. There was a bracket that we made for Buick, Olds, and Pontiac. There was a bracket that welded to the rear housing, and some of the holes were what your shock absorbers fitted to.
Oh yeah.
It was an 07, 1, and 2 bracket. Those are the last 3 digits. I'll remember them to my dying day. We made them for Oldsmobile, we made them for Pontiac, we made them for Buick. Olds wanted them on the narrow side, Buick wanted them on the wide side, Pontiac wanted them vanilla or strawberry or something. And just by putting those parts from a press, putting them in a gong, changed the dimensions because they're a press metal. That was a very, very difficult part to make to satisfy all 3 users. And if our reorganization does anything, those are the things that they should have addressed. You know, Ed Cole made quite a stride in commonality between the parts, but they never took it to that last big push. Because one guy would want a square hole, one guy would want a round hole, and the other guy would want an oblong hole, just for their own individual, I got this the way I want it type. And those are the things that caused a lot of problems in the sheet metal world, because it was a difficult part to make, and then trying to maintain 3 different dimensions to satisfy 3 different people was just ridiculous.
And you said you were dealing with like 1,000 different part numbers?
Yeah, it was about 1,000 different parts. Yeah. That's why somebody up in your old building thought it'd be a whiz bang of an idea if we could give the idea was all right. It was just the vehicle in which it was delivered. This little desk calendar was working so good for most. Of course, the desk calendar was only as good as the guy that was keeping it.
That's right. Yeah.
That's where the rub came.
Yeah.
Now we figured if we can get this into a computer, and all these part numbers go in there, and the arithmetic will all be done by the computer. There wasn't anything wrong with the theory. But just the fact that you couldn't expect a guy to sit there and paw through a whole stack of green and white IBM paper to find his 1 or 2 parts he was interested in for that particular day. Because sometimes those parts Oh, you might cycle them once a month.
Yeah.
For example, if they're a standard transmission part, you cycle them once a month. And if they're a heavy user, well, you'd cycle them
might be all
every
the
3 or
time.
4 days, yeah. Or, yeah, in some cases, it might be all the time.
Yeah.
But those are some of the things
Yeah.
that as time marched on, I'm sure.
Now, did that ever get what I call settled so that that computer schedule thing worked, or?
I'd call it a draw.
You'd
I
do
would
it,
call it
okay.
a draw, yeah. The small parts, I think a lot of it just died a natural death. When we went to a unitized body, I think that reduced a lot of the underbody parts. And somebody else were making the parts someplace,
Yeah.
but we weren't making them.
Yeah.
And I think some of the need to some degrees went away. The part numbers got less. And then some of those part numbers were replaced by plastic.
Oh, yes.
And I suppose some of them were purchased.
Yeah.
And we just weren't making that larger number.
Yeah. Judd, how did people view the transition from sheet metal to plastics? How did folks feel about that then, when that happened in the 60s?
Well, it was a new experience for everyone. You approach it like you do a lot of things. God, if it's here, I better learn what I need to know about it. Some of us went up to GMI and took some courses up there.
Yeah.
We made visits to other plants, and we went to Farrell. They were making the injection molding equipment. I think they're in Rochester, New York. We visited their plant because most of us had never seen an injection molding machine, not the size that we were looking at here, 2,500 ton. They were big models. And the whole thing was entirely different because you bought the material and you heated it up and filled this cavity, and out came whatever it is, like a filler plate.
Much different than what you're used to as a sheet metal person.
The dye people probably had one of the larger problems, because here you had to seal off this mold, and your nomenclature changed. You went from dyes, calling things dyes, to calling them molds, and your tolerances were more critical.
Okay.
Not to the fact that if the thing was a little thicker or a little thinner, it would be that much of it, but it was the way the dyes made it. It was probably more critical. It's one of those things that over a period of time, people got comfortable with it.
Was it kind of a tough thing to get started with, so to speak?
In some ways, it's like a lot of things. Some were tougher than others. There was one particular part to be made. It was a transmission cover. It was the first part we got approved. It was the very first part we got approved by engineering to run.
Okay.
And it was the last part we got in production, because it was so good. We had trouble with them warping.
Oh, yeah.
Because they'd come out of the mold warm, and by the time they were cooled, why, of course, they were all twisted out of shape.
Okay.
So then you had to go through a process of cooling fixtures, so you can maintain that shape while they cooled. And
Now, the plastics machines themselves didn't take a man to run them, or what, was it different from a manpower allocation, so to speak?
You had people unloading them. They had loaded automatically and dropped on a conveyor. So you had a person on every machine, because they were like on a filler plate. They were filler plates that come down, you'd have to stack them in a container.
Okay.
And then you had mold setters. The mold setter might take care of half a dozen molding machines to make sure that the temperatures and the time and temperature are very critical. So you had to maintain that. You had a material handling probably took as much labor as anything else. And packing the parts, because some of them had to be nested and packed almost like you're packing eggs. Not that they were fragile, but to keep them from getting damaged in transit. And the containers you used, lots of times would vary with the part. Then after the injection molding machines came in, we went to sheet molded compound, SMC. That went on, the old fender line there in 56 was taken out, and these vertical injection mold, or SMC machines were put in. There again you changed, where your injection molding was pellets that you heated up. SMC was a result of putting fiberglass and polyesters together, and then cutting them out would be like grandma making biscuits.
Okay.
After you roll the dough out, why you put them in this press to make your front end panels primarily. And that was probably much more difficult because it was a cosmetic part. It was something that you could see right on the car, where most of the injection molding was underneath the car somewhere.
Okay.
And surface finish wasn't critical. And by that I mean you don't want, I'm not talking about holes in it. I'm talking about reinforcing members that where you could read through, that were highlighted, where you could.
This is a recording of Judson Cordis, Judd Cordis, of Lansing, Michigan. The recording was made at the Oldsmobile History Center by Jim Walkinshaw on May 12, 1989. This is tape number 2 of 2 tapes.
For an SMC product has much to learn about how to design that, I think, as we did learn how to make it, because they would invariably design it with a reinforcing rib right on the what you call the A surface, and if you're standing there eyeballing it, we could see that little wow in the surface. But eventually they learned where to put the reinforcements. And porosity is a problem in SMC also.
Okay. So I remember there was a lot of difficulties with what I'll call dermatitis or that sort of thing, the fiberglass itch.
Yeah, but that supposedly wasn't hazardous to your health.
No, but it was just
it was irritating. Well, it's just like crawling around your attic, you know.
Right.
Yeah. And then SMC was no more than that got livable, and this reinforced injected material. There was another effort. Making front and rear fascia panels for the Corvette. And that had about as many idiosyncrasies in it as the other two combined.
So each one of these got kind of progressively more difficult, so to speak? Mm-hmm. What were some of the difficulties with the rim, Joe?
Oh, porosity. And you were putting material into this, warm material into this mold, and then some of those nozzles would get plugged up. You'd end up with what they call a crossfire. Then you get your material contaminated. I can't remember all the rest of the agonizing we would do over it, but a lot of it was cosmetic.
Mm-hmm. That was a flubber or very flexible material.
It was I'll think of the name in a minute, but it's this foaming process. Same thing they make skis out of and stuff like that. Cyanide, polycyanide. God, I thought I'd never forget it. It'll come to me in the middle of the night, probably.
That's okay. Now, that stuff was made not down in the press shop, as I remember it, though.
No, that was made up there in the, what is it, 75?
Maybe out in
What?
78?
It's way up, it's up there right across
The old
the...
plating plant, where the old
Yeah,
plating plant
yeah.
was.
What was the old plating plant?
78.
78, yeah, that's what the plating plant went out and ring went in.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
See, you stayed in the press shop, Judd, how long did you stay there in that, as a superintendent?
Oh, I stayed there from, well, I went in there in 58, and I left about 69 or 70 when
Who was your boss during that period of time?
Bob Scott. When Bill Freeman retired, and I was working for Bob Scott.
Okay.
And then Elmer Corbin retired out of Plant 2.
Yeah.
I went over there and took his place as general superintendent.
Now, was the differential plant
Yeah.
there at that time?
Yeah, they were there. The forge plant was there,
Okay.
and the scrap utilization was there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What about that?
Well, scrap utilization, the idea was all right, but the conversion costs were what were terrible. Well, it was during that energy crunch,
Yeah.
and God, the price of scrap ton for steel, I think, went from $55 a ton up to $125 a ton, and you just couldn't afford to you keep it and use your plus you added that increase in cost in steel plus your conversion costs, and couldn't be competitive.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was all right,
And the machinery and the equipment functioned.
yeah. But we made steel for our rods, axles, some of our ring gears.
Mm-hmm.
It was an extrusion process.
Mm-hmm.
You took your scrap and add your alloying. You had 3 electric ovens or furnaces, which you melted it down, and you poured it into a ladle. That poured it into I think they were called vessels that, while it was still hot, and it was extruded out into a log about 8 or 10 feet long, about 4 inches in diameter. And that went through another little furnace to bring it up to what you might call maintenance forging ability. And that went into a little rolling mill where you rolled it to the diameters you needed to make your rods and axles
Okay.
and ring gears out of.
And the reason we quit doing that was basically a cost
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
It wasn't that we couldn't make it.
No, we made rods, and like I mentioned,
Yeah.
no, we had them in cars. No, it was, well, I don't know, maybe ran for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. And the differential plant was in operation when you arrived there.
Yeah.
So they'd gone through the problem of getting it running, so to speak.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that started in mid-60s, about 1966, I believe.
Somewhere in there, yes.
And I went over there about 69 or 70.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And I was there until about 73, when Bob Scott retired. And I went over to, took his job
At plant 3?
at Plant 3, which put me back in the press plant at Plant 1.
All right. Because he had both of them?
Yeah, at Plant 3 and Plant 1.
All right. Let's see, at plant 3, at that juncture, 304 was there,
Yeah, 304 was there, and I think 305 went up about that time.
okay.
Because we moved equipment from the press plant over to 304 in 1967.
Yeah,
I believe then 305 was built.
okay. Plating plants, was
Yeah,
there?
plating plant was still there, yeah.
And not rods, but
Cranks.
and
Rods,
rods were there? Okay.
cranks and rods. And there was a bumper line. Anyway, then I went back between plant 3 and plant 1, that's when the ring came in.
Okay.
I got jumped ahead before.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah. And then that stayed there until about 78. And the plant was, Bob Mooney was general manufacturing manager about that time, and did a little reorganizing. And I ended up with the press plant and the engine plant. So I was back, and I'd come full circle after 30 years. I was back in the engine plant again with the press plant.
Okay. That was both plants again, Judd? Plant 3 and plant 1, or just plant 1?
Yeah, well, I had plant 1 press, the engine plant of plant 1, and also plant 5 was coming along at about that time.
All right.
I had that.
All right. Now all the diesel crap was...
Yeah, I got over there. The year I went back to the engine plant was the year the diesel took off.
Oh, yes. Now that must have had some more problems from a manufacturing standpoint.
It was. I'm not going to put it on tape.
Yeah, it's all right. We had a separate, did we have a little separate assembly line for diesel?
Oh yeah, had a separate assembly line for diesel, separate test room.
All right.
Had a common block line.
All right.
Common headline, where by common I mean you change tooling.
Yeah.
But, they would take the V8 gas or they'd take the V8 diesel.
Okay. Yeah. And the test room was, what kind of a test room? Do you remember that?
What kind was it?
Yeah. Wasn't the engine run hot?
Yeah. Yeah, the engine was run hot.
Okay.
Engine was run hot.
And then the plant 5 was coming, you said?
Yeah, that was, what date was that?
It's been 78 or 9, somewhere in there, 9.
June. I think it must have been 7. Well, yeah, you're right. Yeah. Yeah, I remember they were just digging the foundations for it.
Okay. That was for our little B60s.
Yep.
Now, did you stay there to retire, Judd, or what?
Yeah, then I had that until the General Motors reorganization came along in '84.
Okay.
And then when that came along, I went with what is called Power Train.
All right.
The press plant that I had been associated with became part of the Fab organization. So then that Power Train came to town, and their area of responsibility was the engine plant and plant 2. At that time, the differential was being phased out.
Okay.
So that's the way it remained until I was with Power Train until I retired in '86.
Okay, you left in 86.
'86.
What? Go back to some of the other guys you had to work with that maybe we don't know much about. You remember any general managers that you had to deal with at all during that?
No, not on my
earlier
capacity. I remember them by noun name only.
Okay. Didn't have any real
No,
contact.
Jack Wolfram came in the plant just one time, to my knowledge. That
One
was
whole time.
that was back in 1955. He made a visit in the plant. But in later years, of course, there was Bob Cook, Sanchez, John Belts.
Did any of those people get out of the shop much, Judd, that you'd see out there on occasion? Or not?
Well, of course, Bob Cook, saw him a lot.
Okay.
And Sanchez, little time he was here, he spent appreciable part of the time out there.
Okay.
I never remember seeing John Belts out there.
Did you get to work for Bob Rollis at some point in time
Oh,
over there?
yeah. I reported directly to Bob Rollis at one time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you help us a little on Bob, how Bob managed, what kind of a guy he was?
Yeah, he was a very, from the human side of the business, I guess you'd call it.
Okay.
Yeah, I attended a lot of operating meetings that Bob chaired. He could handle himself very well at times of stress. And, I think probably looking back now, he conducted himself in what is today viewed as a people person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's one thing Oldsmobile is, all the way through the organization is always, to my viewpoint, has always been quite strong in, and that's the people side of the business.
Mm-hmm. Judd, how did we manage the whole organization, basically? Did you get any kind of a feel for how that was, how we made adjustments and changes and how they were handled?
Prior to the reorganization?
Oh, yeah, back,
You're
back
talking
in
about
the 50s and 60s.
Well,
that's
everybody
tough.
was ran his own, I wouldn't call it an empire, probably somebody take exception to that, but everybody seemed to run their own area to their own philosophies. In the engine plant, when I worked in the engine plant, press plant, final assembly could have been in Tibet as far as you were concerned as how you ran your plant. There wasn't any interrelationship or association. Each superintendent seemed to operate and run his own particular area according to his own philosophies and sense of values. There didn't seem to be any commonality. There doesn't seem to be any effort in trying to provide a common ground. There wasn't any type of meetings where you got together and exchanged opinions or ideas, each into their own.
The operating meeting that you mentioned, was that a later happening?
No, the operating meeting, that, from my recollection, has always been there.
It's always been.
Yeah, before they started having Building 40, they used to have them over there in the basement, Building 60, back back in the days of Tom Downey.
Oh, yeah.
He's the first works manager I remember.
All right. Did you have enough contact to formulate any feelings about Downey?
No.
Don't know much about him either.
No, those people seem to live in a different, it isn't from the standpoint that their job, it was just a standpoint, that's the way the system seemed to work.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm in press plant, and you're in the final, and they're in building 70, and you're 60 at that time, you're over there. There doesn't seem to be any common denominator. Now, back in the days of Skinner, when he was general manager, people would see him in a plant occasionally.
All right.
I never happened to, but they say that he'd walk through the plant. But if he did, there wasn't any apparent results from it, or any significant changes.
You didn't see any effect of that. What do you think maybe, Judd, was most significant happening in all that period that you were there?
Oh boy, I don't know, Jim. I don't right off the top of my head, can't think of any aha phenomenon or I think the thing that stuck with me most through those years was the respect and that people had for our product. Because regardless of where you go, or where you went, or who owned an Oldsmobile, people always thought of it in high regard. I think if anything significant out of all of this is that the product we made was something you could be proud of. And I know in making visits to other plants, we were always glad to think, boy, I'm glad I work where I do. And not only for a lot of reasons, plant atmosphere, the way people were handled, the product you were making.
Do you think Oldsmobile was somewhat unique in a sense as an industrial concern?
Well, I think they must have been. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been here for 100 years.
Yeah.
And I remember we went and visited a plant one time down in Indiana. It was an automobile plant. It's since gone out of business. But it was on a Thursday, and there really wasn't much going on. And we kind of wondered what we'd even made the trip for. And the guy said, well, he said, they're on piecework, and they got everything out they're going to do for the day. They can't go home. They got to be here, but they're just kind of hanging around.
Your view of reorganization, Judd? The current one?
Well, I think, for the most part, the idea is right. Now, whether everybody needed the same pill remains to be seen. I think there's probably some shaking out needs to be done there. But I think in a lot of respects, it's for the better. Yeah, I think it's for the better. I think we have like a Bill Lane in charge of sales and a Hackworth in charge of production. I think that's a good move, because you stop and think, a general manager, can he be all things to all people? And that's what under the other system it was. And that's kind of hard in this day and age to be that astute on all those various factors. So I think for the most part it's good. But I don't think that the whole organization need to swallow the same pill, but how are you going to divide it up doing anything else? And just talking to people that have left Lansing, gone to other areas, they've told me, my God, Judd, you think you'd flip the calendar and go back 30 years? But we've done things at Lansing for X number of years, and it's all brand new news to these guys.
Interesting.
Yeah. So from that standpoint, yeah, I think
we must have been kind of in the forefront in many places.
Yeah, as far as anything locally, I don't know, just what we've gained other than the two things I mentioned.
Well,
ISO cyanate, that's that stuff.
It came out.
I told you, it was in the middle of the night. But
that's all right.
There was something too. I think they got the largest molds in captivity on those front and rear Corvette panels.
Oh, is that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, they go across the whole front of the car,
sure.
back about 8-9 inches, yeah.
Any other significant happenings you think might be of interest to folks in the future that we haven't chatted about?
I just hope that as time marches on, I hope Oldsmobile still has a place in Lansing, Michigan.
Yes, jury's still out. I remember sitting in a lot of meetings, Judd, with you, and people always used to talk about cordisms. Do you ever remember that word?
Yeah.
Judd would come up with some of the most interesting anecdotes that were appropriate for the occasion.
Well, that's what comes from being on the manufacturing floor for a long time. No, it was an interesting 44 plus years, I tell you, Jim.
Well, okay. I will click her off.
Yeah.